Hello and welcome, this is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to create some dimensional floral cards with the new Natures Botanical Garden collection from Spellbinders. So I have several dies here, plus an embossing folder and better press plates. I'm going to be using the Hydrangea die, the Azalea and Garden Pot with Ladybugs die, the Landscape Rose, the Natures Botanical Wreath 3D embossing folder, and then finally, all cards are going to have sentiments from the Natures Botanical Garden sentiments. I've also recently gotten the Susan's Garden Ultimate Toolkit, and I'm going to be using several tools from this kit in order to help shape those flowers. Now you can use plain cardstock for this, and I am going to for several, but my first two cards, I'm going to be creating some distressed backgrounds and then die cutting those backgrounds for the florals. Just a different way to create some unique papers to do your florals with. So I have some mixed media heavy stock here, and I'm working with 3 different distress colors for this background. For this one, I'm using Tumbled Glass, Kitsch Flamingo, and Shaded Lilac. And I'm working on a Tim Holtz media surface mat. This is the perfect mat or perfect surface to be working on to create these backgrounds. You wouldn't get quite the same background if you were doing this on the glass mat or the glass surface that I normally work on. So I do like to work on the media surface mat for this. So I smushed each one of those ink pads a couple times on my surface mat, misted it with some water, dipped my cardstock in there, and then used my Heat It tool in order to dry it. Now, before I dip it back into that ink, I want to make sure that this is dry, probably like 80 to 90%. If this is too wet, the inks or colors are just going to blend together. They're not going to layer on top of each other. And I want to create a background that has the different colors layered on top of each other. Some blending is okay, but I do want to be able to see distinct patches of the blue, distinct patches of the pink, and distinct patches of the purple. So I want to make sure to be layering these on top of each other. And each time I dip it in the ink, I'm going to use the Heat It tool to dry it almost completely dry. I do leave a few areas that are a tiny little bit wet, but I want it mostly dry because I want to just keep layering these layers. Now this Heat It tool emits heat, but it's a gentle heat. You couldn't use a hairdryer for this because this is just, a hairdryer is just going to blow the ink around. You want a tool that is going to emit heat, but not disturb the inks where they are. So I'll do this usually around 3 or 4 times until I get a background that I like. If at 3 or 4 times there's still some areas that I want to work on a little bit, I'll just keep going. So there's not a set number. Sometimes I'll do my initial background, dip it in once, and for whatever it is that I'm working on, I'll like what the result is there. Sometimes I will go further. So like I said, there's not a certain amount of times that you dip it in the ink. I really love at the end when you have just a couple little splots of ink or splats of ink on the surface, you get some nice texture from those pieces. So this is my first background done here. I'm going to set that aside and I'm going to work on my second background. So for my second background, I'm going to use that same shaded lilac from the first background, but this time I'm going to pair it with Wilted Violet and Milled Lavender Distress Oxide pads. So the first one was all distress pads. Those are dye-based pads and they are transparent. By adding the oxides are a pigment and dye-based or dye blend, so they're going to have some opacity to it. The colors are still going to blend and flow with each other, but it's going to create a bit of a different look to it, and I'll show you that when I've got my 2 backgrounds, you'll see the difference. So I'm going to do the same method as I did with my first one. I smushed each pad a couple times, misted it with water, dipped my mixed media heavy stock in it, and I'm using my Heat It tool to dry it between coats. And again, I'm making sure that it's dry like 80–90%. But once again, depending on the look that you're going for whatever project you're using or creating, if you want the inks to blend a little bit more, you can dip it back in when it's less dry. The other thing you can do, and I'll do it in just a moment, is you can take your distress sprayer and you can spray your background and have those inks start to bleed and blend with each other if you're finding it's getting you're getting too much separation between the colors. So here's where I go and take my distress sprayer, I misted it, and you can see those inks immediately start to bleed and blend with each other. Now I like the look of this, but for what I'm going for, I didn't want to see as much of that Wilted Violet oxide pad. So I'm going to clean off my surface and I'm going to put just the Shaded Lilac Distress pad down, and just the wilted or milled lavender distress pen. So these are the lighter colors. That's going to lighten this background, and it's going to cover it just a tiny bit of that wilted violet. It's not going to eliminate it completely. It's just going to tone it down a little bit. I just didn't want it to get too bright, and I didn't want that wilted violet to completely take over my background. Now, I mentioned earlier that I'm using Distress Mixed Media Heavy Stock. For this technique, it needs to either be heavy stock or mixed media heavy stock that you're using, or watercolor cardstock. You need some sort of cardstock that can handle that moisture. Regular cardstock will not work. It's not going to have the same effect, and you're not going to get this look with it. So once again, you keep going for as long as you want till you get the desired look that you're wanting. Now I'm using the Hydrangea die set with this. So these are going to be cut into tiny little flowers. So you're not going to be able to you're not going to see this entire background here. You're just going to be seeing combinations of the different colors for the backgrounds. And by creating a textured background like this, or visually textured anyways, it's going to create some very unique looking petals. And this is going to create some very unique florals for my cards. Now, once again, you could use solid colored cardstock for this and just do ink blending. That's totally fine. I just wanted to share a different way to create cardstocks or create papers to get some unique florals here. And my last two cards are going to be using solid cardstock with some ink blending. So you see how those look as well. You can compare the two and see the different looks to them. Neither one is right or wrong. They're just personal preferences and just different ways to do things and create different looks. And I always love knowing different ways to create different looks, because once again, depending on the final look that you're going for, or the vibe that you're going for, or what you want to put into it, you're going to choose a different technique. And like I did earlier in this background, if I found that I wanted my colors to blend and bleed a little bit more, I could once again go back with that distress sprayer or a spray bottle and just mist my cardstock and have those inks bleed with each other. You could also take this background and use an ink blending brush and blend some of those colors together. There's a little bit of white space here, or a little bit of space where you can see that Distress Mixed Media Heavy Stock behind there. And if you don't like it, you could use an ink blending tool and make that a little bit more subtle, or remove that entirely. Again, depending on the look that you're going for and what you want your background to look like. But because the flowers that I'm cutting out of this are so tiny, you're not going to see a lot of those details. What I tend to like to do is create these backgrounds, then die cut them, and then if there's an area that I want a little bit of a different color on, then I will go and ink blend. So there's my second background in here. You can see it against or compared with my first one, and you can see how the purple one has a little bit more opacity to it, and the pink, blue, and purple one is a little bit more transparent, and it's got a bit of a different look to it. So now that I have my two backgrounds done, I'm going to die cut those flowers. And these pieces of cardstock are 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. They're a quarter sheet. I'm just going to die cut as many flowers as I can possibly get out of that background. I have my medium-sized craft stacks that I like to use when I'm creating off to the side, and as I'm die cutting these flowers, I'm just going to put them right in there. These are a great tool for organizing and keeping things organized, especially when you're doing a bunch of die cutting in order to assemble later. And I love having way more die cuts than I need when I'm creating, so that I don't have to stop what I'm doing and start die cutting again. So I take that entire piece of cardstock and totally cut it out with all of those die cuts. Now you may get a little bit of transfer from that Distress Oxide ink on your die cutting plates. That just washes right off, so make sure to wash it and dry it so that you don't accidentally get some of that ink transferring over to another project. So I'm just taking my pieces or my tools out from that Ultimate Toolkit, and I'm going to be using the two largest stylus tips in my handle here. There's other tips you can use as well. Those are the ones that I tend to use the most. So I'm just going to put them in each end of my tool, and that way I can just transfer between one tip and the other, but just by flipping my tool over. Put the other ones aside, and I love the fact that they come with a little pouch that can hold them together. So I'm using the foam pad from this kit as well, and it's going to make it really easy to put my cardstock die cuts down and use those stylus tips in order to shape them. It gives you a good surface to do that shaping with. What I like to do is lay several out on my foam pad here. I will have them with the ink color side down, and I will go with the largest tip and kind of just go in a circular motion. And then I will flip them all over once I have all of them done. And then I go with the smaller tip and just do the center of the flower. So you can see how fast they all come together when you're doing a bunch of them at a time. Half a dozen or so at once on a mat, and they come together really, really quickly. Now, these aren't the type of cards that you're going to be making 100 of. These are the ones, in my opinion, that you're going to be making a couple of at a time, and it's more of a labor of love. Because there's a lot more involved in this, I know that it's not everyone's cup of tea, but it's something that I love to do occasionally. It's not something I do for every card. If you've seen any of my videos, I don't do this for every single card, but I do occasionally do this, and I love the dimension that you get when you do the shaping of the petals. Often I will just shape with my fingers, but you get a little bit of extra detail when you use a stylus for your shaping. Now, I should have done this before shaping my flowers, but it's okay. I have my Ultra Sticky Mat out here, and some of the flowers, I've just divided them into 3 piles. One I wanted a pink ink blending on, one I wanted blue, and one I wanted the purple. And I'm just using a detailed ink blending brush and just adding a little bit of extra ink to the center of that flower. And it's just going to give it more of a purple tone, or whatever color ink that I've ink blended with. It's just going to give it a little bit more of that tone. This is not necessarily a step that you have to do, but I love the look of it with a little bit of deeper ink blending in the center of those flowers. And they are only stuck to that mat by the center, but I'm only doing the ink blending on the center of those flowers, so I don't need it stuck completely down flat. I didn't do any ink blending with the purple flowers. I only did it with my first background flowers. For my leaves, because once again, I got a little bit too carried away with those, I just held the tip of the leaf down, used my bigger ink blending brush, and then blended the ink on there. And I just started at the base of the leaf and flicked the brush up. And that was peeled paint distress ink that I ink blended there. So this die set, the Hydrangea die set, comes with this cloud-shaped piece, cloud-ish shaped, in a couple different sizes, and it's meant for you to glue on the florals so that you have all your florals on one piece. It's going to make it much easier to add all these florals to a card by having a base for them to get glued on first, and then you can let that dry, and then you can start to assemble your card. I'm using the reverse tweezers to help me glue those in place. I can put the reverse tweezers on a petal, transfer that flower from hand to hand, and I don't have to worry about the tweezers dropping it until you squeeze the handle to release it. I'm using some Barely Art glue in a fine tip bottle. I use this for most of my projects. I just like the fact that I can put as little or as much glue as I want to, and I can use that same glue bottle for gluing the pieces of my cards together, or little fine die cuts like this. So when I'm gluing these die cuts here, I tend to start from the outside and then start working my way in. I will sometimes put the flowers below the ones beside it, sometimes above the ones beside it. But then once I have it down and I figured out where I want it to go, I'll use the tip of those tweezers just to kind of press the center of the flower where I have the glue down, just so that it has good contact with the cardstock underneath it and it can start to dry there. I did about 2/3 of the outside before starting to work my way in the middle. I like to start doing the outside before center ones because I want those center ones to be in front of the ones that I have on the outside. So I do want to do some of the outside ones before completing those center ones. I don't want to have the ones on the outside in front of ones from the center. The reason being, most of these hydrangeas are kind of almost a round ball-ish shape, and the ones that are on the outside of it would be behind the ones that you see in the center. So by doing those on the outside first and having the ones in the center in front of those, you keep with that look. So by having all of those florals die cut and shaped, you can see how quickly these flowers come together. Once I have that whole background completely filled, I can set that aside to dry. The one thing I want to do before setting that aside to dry is I'm just taking some stickles and I'm putting a dot of stickles in the centers of those flowers. It's just going to add just a little bit of a sparkle texture to it that I just really like. You could also use like perfect pearls or liquid pearls or Nouveau drops or something like that, just again to add just a bit of a different texture and to complete the center of that flower. So now I'm doing that same thing for the smaller blobs or cloud shapes from this die set, and I've got the rest of my hydrangeas completed. For the second card, I'm turning them into lilacs. So I just took the two smaller pieces of those kind of cloud shapes and I die cut that a couple times, so I have 3 in total. Did the same technique for gluing my flowers down. The thing that I'm going to do different for these ones is I have some tiny nail gems, and I'm going to put these in the center of the flowers. They're going to be very similar to the stickles. They're going to give a little bit of sparkle, but it's just a different way of doing this. If you haven't seen me do this before, I do this often around Christmas time where appropriate. These make really great centers for tiny poinsettias, and I've used them for that. You could use it on, say, a tree die cut where you use it as little tiny ornaments. These nail gems come in so many different colors that it's really fun to coordinate them with whatever that you're doing. And they come in a few different sizes as well. And they tend to come in smaller sizes than what you get with other gems. Now, Spellbinders does have a package, or in different colors, of gems that have some really tiny ones in there. Those ones are similar in size to these nail gems. So that's another great way to do that. These, I just use that Barely Art glue, put a dot in the center of the flowers, use a jewel picker to pick up those gems and put them in the center of the flowers, and then let them dry. If you didn't want to do all of those steps, the Spellbinders packages of essential jewels, gems, are a perfect way to go. And those sheets of gems have 4 different sizes to choose from. So once I have all the gems that I want on the centers of my flowers, I'll just tuck those to the side. Those will dry while I'm continuing to work on my card. Because there's only a drop of glue that is used for attaching these gems, they really come together, or they're really dry fairly quickly. So I'm going to use the Nature's Botanical Garden Sentiments press plate set in order to create the sentiments for my cards. So the first piece here, I've got a piece of porcelain Better Press cardstock, and I'm going to use the tumbled glass distress ink to create, or to ink my sentiment here. You can use the Better Press inks, but you can also use other inks as well. There hasn't been an ink yet that I have found doesn't work with this. So I like to use my distress inks because I use them mostly for doing the ink blending, and that way I can make sure that my sentiment completely coordinates with my image pieces or my die cuts. So I put it in the bottom left corner of the marking on the Better Press plate, or the base, so that when I flipped it back over after it's done, it's going to be on the bottom right of my card. Now, the first pressing there, it wasn't as dark as I wanted it to be, so I'm going to ink my plate up again. I use a soft cloth, a dry cloth, just to clean off my plate to make sure I don't accidentally get any ink transfer over to it. Now, I have yellow tape on between the base and the gray mat of my Better Press, and that's to make sure it doesn't shift on me. And I found that ever since doing that, if I have to put something through a second time or a third time even, I get it in perfect placement every time, and it never ever moves on me. For the second one, I've got another piece of Better Press cardstock. I'm putting my sentiment in the center, and I'm using that Wilted Violet oxide ink to do my sentiment here. This is a sentiment I want to do some die cutting, or I want to die cut out. So I'm putting it in the center of my cardstock so that I can have lots of room on all sides to make sure I get perfect placement of that sentiment. This one I'm also going to do multiple times, so I'll ink my sentiment, use that dry cloth to clean off any excess ink, and then put it through my Spellbinders Platinum 6 machine. So after doing it a second time, I decided to do it just one more time. So I lightly inked it. This time I didn't clean off the outside because I didn't get any ink transfer onto my base. Put it through my Platinum 6, and now it's good. So I taped it in all 4 corners when I'm doing this. You don't necessarily have to. It's kind of overkill, but I reuse that tape over and over again until it stops sticking. So it gets a lot of good use out of it. I want this piece die cut in a circle, so I'm using the Stitched Edge circle dies. This is from the recent Spotlight Frames and Florals collection. That is a collaboration between Spellbinders and Lisa Horton Crafts. And I love that it puts the stitched detail around the outside of that circle. So now that I have those die cuts down, I can start getting ready to assemble my card. I have my Better Press sentiment background here that I just cut down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. I have my blue mat here that is die cut to 4 1/8. by 5 3/8. So I'm going to have just a really tiny mat around each piece. I wanted to make sure to leave plenty of room for my florals. I didn't want to run out of room with these, and I wanted just a tiny little mat on them. I'm using that same Barely Art glue to glue it together, and in between gluing things together and laying it down, I'm using a large acrylic block just to hold my pieces down, make sure that everything stays nice and flat. And I also like to use it while it's holding things down to make sure that I have the right placement for my florals. It's always nice to be able to see it right on that background to see if the design that I have in my head is going to work or if I need to adjust it a little bit. And by having it right on that background, it makes it really easy to adjust it. Then I can lift that block off, move it to the side, and I have it placed exactly where I want it to. For my leaves, now that I have my florals down, I'm going to glue or put a little bit of glue at the base of the leaf, and I'm just going to tuck it beneath. Because I glued it down with liquid glue, it takes a few moments for it to really start to grab, so I can easily tuck things in and adjust things as I'm going while I'm working because that glue hasn't completely taken hold. I only put glue at the base of the leaf because I like it when I'm using florals and foliage, and I like it when things flip up a little bit or not completely flat. It gives it some extra dimension to it. I've never had an issue with anything not being secure, and because these cards that I'm creating have a lot of dimension to them, chances are I'm not going to be putting them into a snug envelope. I'd be putting them into something bigger or just hand delivering it. And really, in all likelihood, it would be hand delivering it because I don't want to flatten any of those florals. Now, if you put this in an envelope, yes, it will start to flatten because that's going to press down. If you wanted to keep some of that dimension, you could, with each of the florals, you could use a little tiny bit of glue behind it, let that completely dry, and it's just going to help prop it up a little bit. But like I said, these type of things are a labor of love, and it's something that I probably would hand deliver to someone. For the second card, for the lilacs here, I didn't have, or this die doesn't have any stems to it, so I used the stems from the Layered Anemone die set. This is from that same Stitch or Spotlight Frames and Florals collection with Lisa Horton Crafts and Spellbinders. So it's from that same collection, but it does have a set of stems as well as a set of leaves. So I'm going to use that for these lilacs just to give them something to hold on to. I think it would be a little bit odd just using the florals on their own. I think they just need to have a leaf to them, or sorry, a stem to them. So this die set was perfect for that. So once again, I'm gluing everything together with that Barely Art glue, and while that is drying or catching, I'm going to assemble my florals on the top just to get an idea of how I want them to look, and then I can start assembling everything. I'll put down my stems first, or at least the majority of my stems. Sometimes if I have a larger arrangement, I'll only do a couple, and then I will start putting my florals down, and then we'll adjust. This time I ended up putting all of my stems down because I knew exactly where all of them were going to go, and there was only 3 of them. Now that I have those stems down, I can take those florals and put them down at the end of the stems, once again with that same glue. I don't add the leaves until I have my florals down, and then I can tuck those leaves in any place where I kind of feel it just needs a little something, or it's a little bit bare. It makes it much easier to tuck them in at the end. I can just use those leaves as little filler pieces. Now, I absolutely love the way this turned out using the hydrangea as a lilac. So just take a look at your dies or your die cuts, the shapes of them. So often you can turn them into something else other than what they were created for or intended for, and it gives those dies or even those stamps an extra use. It's always nice to have many more things that we can do with something other than what it's intended to be used as. So here is our finished lilac card, and we're ready to work on the next one. So the next one, I'm using the Azalea and Garden Pot with Ladybugs. I decided to do my azaleas pink, so I took some cardstock scraps, cut out a bunch of the die cut pieces, and I have them stuck down to my ultra sticky mat to do the ink blending in the center of the florals. I'm using some picked raspberry distress ink here, just using a regular ink blending brush, but you can see I'm going clockwise and counterclockwise on all of the petals. I want to make sure that I don't have it a little bit heavier ink blended on one side than the other, and by going both ways I can make sure it's nice and even. I'm keeping everything towards the center of the floral. I want to make sure that I still see some of that original cardstock color. but I also want a nice deep ink blend on the center. For my leaves, I'm just using some peeled paint, and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going both clockwise and counterclockwise just to get a nice even blend. I start at the base of the leaf and work my way out, and once again I'm making sure that there's still some of that original color left on those leaves. The last piece to ink blend is my flower pot, and once again I used a lot of cardstock scraps for the floral die cuts. I also did for the pot here. I'm using some Rusty Hinge distress ink in order to ink blend and get some shading to that flower pot. Once I have everything ink blended, I can put my mat away and I can start to assemble my die cuts, starting with the flower pot. It's very easy to know exactly what goes where with the flower pot. There's one rim on the top. Most of it of the top anyways is going to be covered with the die cut florals, but it's always nice to put those pieces there and make sure that they're there, just in the off chance that you have some of the areas exposed. By having these little layers here, it gives it some extra dimension and a little bit more realistic looking. So with that flower pot done, I'm going to put my acrylic block over top of it and start working on my florals. So shaping these florals is very similar to the last one, just on a little bit larger scale. I'm taking the larger of my stylus tips and I'm just going in a circular motion on those leaves. If on the smaller leaves I want a little bit more roundness, I can go in with my smaller one, but I find that the larger one is enough, at least for the amount of shaping that I like anyways. If you wanted more, there's a smaller stylus tip as well in the kit. You could even go a little bit smaller with your stylus tips, especially for the really tiny hydrangea flowers, but I didn't find that I needed it. I like to have a little bit of curvature in there, a little bit of detail, but I tend not to do too much. So once again, I'm putting my florals down with the ink blended side down, using the larger tip to shape it in a circular motion, then flip it over, and then I use the smaller tip and I tend to just press that center in order to get that indent on the center of the flowers. You could use a circular motion and get the shape that way, but I find just pressing it is enough. Then I take the two petaled piece and glue it behind the 3 petaled piece. You'll notice with that 3 petaled piece, there's one petal that's a little bit taller than the others. There's 2 sides that are a little bit wider spacing than the others, and that's where those 2 petals go. So once I have all of those done and glued, I set that aside to dry and I can work on the center. The center die cut is kind of an odd shaped piece, so I like to curl those edges over with my fingers, use the reverse tweezers, the straight reverse tweezers, in order to spin it, in order to roll it, and then put a tiny dot of glue at the end, and then I use those reverse tweezers to hold it in place while that glue starts to set. It doesn't need to be 100% set, but you do need to have something hold it in place in order for that glue to really hold. If you let it go right away, it's just going to start to come loose. So I have my own reverse tweezers that I've had for a while, so I'm using those for some of them, and I'm using the straight edged ones from the Ultimate Toolkit in order to roll it. There's a few different ways that I'm doing this here. The first one, I just kind of curved those little salmon pieces and then rolled it. The other one, I rolled it first and then curled them. Basically, find what works for you. The third way I did it was just crumpling that whole piece, flattening it out, and then rolling it, just to really soften that paper before I rolled it. And I ended up finding the way that I preferred was the first way I did it anyways, by curling those ends over my fingers, then rolling it, and then adding a dot of glue. So I did the rest of them off screen, and I started working on my little ladybugs. I had them die cut out of a piece of red cardstock scraps, and I'm just using a black Copic marker in order to color the head black as well as add the dots. For this, I wanted to use a permanent marker because I wanted to add some glossy accents to those wings to make them nice and glossy, just to give my piece here a little bit of extra texture. With those glossy accents on there, I can set that to the side and let that completely dry. And then I'm going to use my better press to add a sentiment, or to create a sentiment for this card. So I'm using that same picked raspberry ink that I did the ink blending on my cardstock, inking that sentiment up, using that dry cloth to remove that excess ink, and then putting my clear plate over my base, running it through my die cutting machine. Now you can see that I'm using the scrap part from my last sentiment. Because there was a nice strip left there, I figured I might as well use it up and make sure that it didn't go to waste. Once that sentiment was pressed on there, I used the coordinating die and die cut it out. It's really nice when you have these press plates that have these die sets to them. So you can choose and you can customize your sentiment to what you're creating. Sometimes you're going to want to have that sentiment on the background, and sometimes you're going to want to have that completely die cut out. For my mat here, I'm using a piece of Hero Art's Azalea cardstock. It matches the florals perfectly, and I loved the fact that the cardstock was named Azalea, as well as these floral die cuts are azaleas. I cut my mats the same for this card as I did for my last one. My Azalea colored mat was 5 3/8 by 4 1/8. My white mat here is 4 inches by 5 1/4. So I just placed my flower pot over top of my acrylic block there, and I just wanted to add a little bit more dimension to the flowers. Now, after I rolled up those centers of the flowers, I just glued them flat to the centers of the die cut flowers, but they stick up straight a lot. So I wanted to hold them and then just kind of give a little bit more dimension to my flowers. So you can see exactly how I did that. I just held those centers and then just kind of folded the petals around it. It just gives it a little bit more dimension. Now I've got my flower pot glued down, and I'm going to start to assemble and glue my florals. So once again, I'm kind of working from the outside and then kind of working my way in. Any of the florals that are going to be behind the ones in the center would be tucked behind anyways. So the easiest way to do it is just to glue that down, or glue those pieces down first before gluing down the center florals. If you wanted to glue down the center ones and then work around them, you could easily tuck those florals behind the other ones. Because the leaves or the flowers are sticking up and the petals are sticking up and we've got lots of dimension to that, it's really easy to do. You can see as I'm working that those flowers and everything, they're kind of getting bumped and moved. That's totally fine. Once I'm completely done, once I have everything exactly where I wanted it to, I can push down on the center of the flowers, push down on the bases of the leaves, just to make sure that those areas that have the glue on it have some good contact with the back of my card base and that they are being glued down securely. For the top or for the kind of back parts, I can fold some of those flowers in half and glue them down just to kind of see a side profile of the flower. So I did that on the top right there. I also did it on the top left and then changed my mind and didn't really like the one on the top left. So I do end up pulling that one out, and you can see me doing that really quickly. I didn't want it to be too symmetrical. I like evenness, but for something like this, I wanted it to be a little bit or more natural looking, and it was a bit too symmetrical when I had one on each end. Once the florals are how I want them, I can glue that sentiment down. Here, this is after it's kind of glued down for a few moments, and I'm just kind of poking everything just to make sure that everything is secure before I continue. If at this point there's something that isn't completely secure, I can put some glue underneath it and make sure that that is down nice and securely. The last thing I wanted to do was just add a touch of stickles to the centers of those stamens. It's just going to add a little bit of a different texture and just some sparkle with the glitter. It's not something that's realistic looking, but I love that it just kind of draws your eye to those flowers with that little bit of sparkle there. And you can see how much texture and dimension this card has. So once again, this isn't one that I would stuff in an envelope because you would lose all of that beautiful dimension. It's one that I would give or hand to someone. For my last card, I'm going to be using the Landscape Rose die set, and I'm also going to use the Nature's Botanical wreath. Now, before I emboss my cardstock, I want to put my sentiment on my cardstock. And because when I do 3D embossing, I like to mist my cardstock to make sure that those paper fibers are softened, I'm going to use a Better Press ink for this because it's permanent. I think the color I used was Wild Berry. I'll check and I'll put it in the description with the supplies just to make sure that I have the correct color down. But because this ink is permanent, when I go to mist this cardstock for putting it through the 3D embossing folder, that ink isn't going to move. If I were to do this with Distress ink and then mist it with the mister before putting it in my embossing folder, that ink would start to bleed, and that's not the look that I'm going for. So by having permanent ink, I know that it's not going to move anywhere. I know that I'm going to still have a nice crisp sentiment once I'm done. So I can set that aside to completely dry. And that's when I realized that I forgot to add my ladybugs to my last card. So I quickly grabbed my ladybugs, and then just put a little bit of the Barely Art glue on them and put them on some of the flower petals. I love the fun detail this adds, and the fact that they're covered in glossy accents once again gives you another texture to look at on this card. So now that that is done and those are drying, I can start ink blending my flowers. So I've got my background here, and they've got two different flowers to them. One of them is fairly similar looking to these landscape roses, and one is, it's got kind of pointy petals on it. So I'm just going to put some of these dimensional flowers on top of the ones with the pointy petals. They're a shape that I don't necessarily love, and I like the thought of having the embossed florals that are similar looking to these landscape roses in between the actual dimensional ones. So for my ink blending, I had a spun sugar ink pad that I dipped in for the first one and then started ink blending. But to be honest, I have a feeling there was a whole lot of ink left on my brush because I didn't need to add to it once. I had some really light cardstock for these florals, and I wanted to keep it nice and light, so I didn't want to go too heavy with my ink blending. After doing those florals, I decided that I really thought I wasn't going to need any of these larger leaves, even though I do a little bit of ink blending on some of them. I actually don't use them for my card. I think they're going to be too big for that card background. So I end up just using the smallest ones of all the ones that I've die cut. I'm using that same peeled paint distress ink that I've been using for my greenery. It's one of my favorites for doing ink blending on greenery because it's just kind of a nice medium green, but it's not too bright of a green. It's perfect for foliage, in my opinion. So for the centers of the florals, I have a light yellow cardstock, and I'm just going to do some ink blending with scattered straw with a detailed ink blending brush. This way I can get right into that center, and I can just add some subtle ink blending here. And while I have these inks out, I'm just going to do a little bit of light ink blending on my embossed background. I'm not adding any ink to my ink blending brushes. I'm only ink blending with the ink that is actually left on the brushes. I don't want these to overpower my dimensional florals, but I want them to tie in with it. So by just using the color that is already on my brush, I can make sure that I don't make it too dark. And you can see by looking at it, there was plenty of ink there. There was no need to add any more. And I did that with the lightest of hands. I wanted to make sure that that ink only went on the raised surface and I didn't get any on my background. For my florals, I'm shaping them the same way I shaped the azaleas. I'm putting them ink side down using the larger of the stylus tips and then flipping them over and just kind of pressing in the center. For each one of these flowers, you need 2 of the 3 petaled the 3 petaled large pieces and 1 of the small pieces. And this die set, it says it right on the side of the die how many you need for each flower. So it's really handy to see that. Once the 2 larger pieces are glued together, I can put a little bit of glue on the smaller of the 3 petaled pieces and then add that to the center. There's 2 kind of spiky little die cuts here for the center, one bigger than the other. So I quickly shaped them with the largest stylus tip and then put them in the center of the flower. There is also a smaller piece, like the azalea, that gets rolled up for the center. These pieces are a lot shorter. So I don't roll these with my hand first. I just kind of roll them up with my reverse tweezers, put a dab of glue on the end, and then use those reverse tweezers to hold them to let that glue start to set. So I did the rest of those florals off screen because once you've seen one, seeing all of them repeated isn't going to be helpful. They're all exactly the same, and I can start to assemble my card. Just like my last card, these mats are cut the same. My embossed piece here is cut to 4 inches by 5 1/4. My green piece is cut to 4 1/8 by 5 3/8. And that green piece is Hero Art's Kiwi or Hero Hue's Kiwi cardstock. It matched perfectly with the greenery, so it was perfect for this. So I have 5 flowers that are done here or ready to go, and I ended up only using 4. I thought I would use the 5th one because I like odd numbers when I do things like this, but I thought the 5th one was just kind of going to overpower the card. You can see how these florals are a lot larger than the embossed ones on the back, but I love the detail or the combination of that embossed floral on the back with the dimensional ones on the front. It's a little bit asymmetrical, seeing some at the bottom left and some at the top right, but I just really like the look and the combination of the different dimensions. So once again, I'm just putting glue on the center of the flowers, having that glued down because of the dimension, and then adding glue to the base of my leaves and tucking those where I feel that it needs a little bit of that green color as well as a little bit of filling in. So I was correct that those larger leaves would have been too big for what I was going for here. So when you're using these leaves, you can tuck them in as much or as little as you want. And I love the look of just the tip of those leaves poking out. They combine or coordinate beautifully with the ink blended or colored leaves on that embossed background and really enhance it. Once I have my florals exactly how I want, I can let that sit and dry. But of course I have to add just a touch of stickles to the stamen in the center of the flowers. Again, I love that tiny little bit of sparkle. And because there's only a little dot or a little dab on the ends of each one of those, it really does dry fairly quickly. Now I chose to make this card smaller, as in A2 instead of A7, but that folder is really designed and perfectly sized for an A7 card, so it's a larger card, 5 by 7. So if you did a larger card, your florals wouldn't go outside of your card perimeter as much. But like I said before, these are the type of cards that I would hand deliver, and I wouldn't necessarily put in an envelope because that would flatten them. So I didn't mind going outside of the outside sides of the cards. So these are the finished cards. I love all the texture and dimension you get from those florals. It just creates something really, really special. Thank you so much for spending your time with me. I really appreciate you being here. I hope you have a fantastic day.